Imagine a galaxy where strength is measured in the destruction of planets, where warriors can tear through space itself with their bare hands, and where entire civilizations bow before the might of legendary fighters who have conquered star systems for sport. For 10,000 years, the Galactic Combat Federation has crowned champions whose names echo across the cosmos like thunder. Now imagine all of them. Every single undefeated champion, every legendary warrior, every being that could reshape reality with a thought, vanishing without a trace after facing one simple challenge: fighting humans. Not the humans you know. Not the humans from your peaceful little blue planet who barely mastered fire a few millennia ago, but humans who somehow, impossibly, arrive from the outer rim of the galaxy with technology that shouldn't exist, tactics that defy all military doctrine, and a disturbing habit of treating the universe's most feared warriors like practice dummies. The last transmission from Zephyrus the World Ender, a being who once punched a moon in half, was 3 words: they're not normal. That was 6 months ago. Since then, 12 more galactic champions have accepted the human challenge. None have returned. None have even sent a distress signal. The galaxy is asking one terrifying question: what happened to our greatest fighters? But perhaps they should be asking something else entirely. What are these humans, really, and why do they fight like they've been preparing for this war their entire lives? Welcome to the story that will answer these questions and change everything you thought you knew about humanity's place in the universe. The observation deck of the Crimson Nexus station stretched across 3 kilometers of reinforced quantum glass, offering an unobstructed view of the combat arena below. Ambassador Crixtal adjusted her ceremonial robes and pressed her 4-fingered hands against the barrier, watching as maintenance drones swept up the remains of what had once been a small asteroid. The debris scattered like glitter across the arena floor, each piece containing enough rare metals to fund a colony for decades. Another impressive demonstration, she murmured to her aide, though her voice carried a note of concern that hadn't been present in years past. The Galactic Combat Federation had operated for over 10,000 standard cycles, serving as both entertainment and a means of settling disputes between the hundreds of species that comprise the galactic community. Warriors from across the known universe came to test their skills, to prove their worth, and to claim the ultimate prize: recognition as a galactic champion. The title carried with it not just prestige, but real political power. Champions could speak for entire star systems, broker trade agreements worth trillions of credits, and command fleets that could reshape the balance of power across the galaxy. Crixtal had served as the Federation's chief ambassador for nearly 3 centuries, overseeing matches that had become the stuff of legend. She had watched Thryon the unstoppable tear through a platoon of war mechs with nothing but his natural claws. She had witnessed Vexari the Mind-Breaker defeat an entire army by turning their own thoughts against them. She had seen Gorith the Planet Splitter quite literally split a planet during a particularly intense championship match. But in all her years of service, she had never seen anything like what the humans had done to their opponents. The first human ship had arrived at the Nexus 6 months ago, emerging from a hyperspace jump that should have been impossible with their apparent level of technology. The vessel itself was unremarkable by galactic standards, roughly 200 meters in length, sporting what appeared to be primitive fusion drives and basic energy shielding. Its hull bore the scars of countless battles, patched with materials that shouldn't have been able to maintain structural integrity in deep space. The ship's captain had introduced himself simply as Marcus Chun, representing something called the Terran Defense Corps. He was average in height by human standards, perhaps 1.8 meters tall, with dark hair that showed premature gray at the temples and eyes that seemed to catalog everything around him with mechanical precision. When he spoke, his voice carried an odd quality, calm and measured, but with an underlying tension like a wire stretched to its breaking point. "We've come to test ourselves against your champions," he had told the Federation Council during that first meeting. "Our people have heard stories of the great warriors who gather here. We wish to prove ourselves worthy of standing among them." The council members had exchanged glances that ranged from amused to incredulous. Humans were known throughout the galaxy, though mostly as an oddity, a relatively young species from the outer rim that had somehow developed faster-than-light travel despite their biological limitations. They were regarded much the same way one might regard a clever pet that had learned to operate simple machinery, impressive for their species, but hardly a threat to the established order. Ambassador Vorthicay of the Hegemony had been the first to speak, his massive frame casting shadows across the council chamber as he leaned forward. Human, your species is known for its ambition. But the warriors who compete here are not like the pirates and raiders you may have encountered in your frontier regions. Our champions are beings who have mastered the fundamental forces of reality itself. Perhaps you would be better served observing a few matches before. We didn't come here to observe, Chun had interrupted, his tone remaining perfectly level. We came to fight. The silence that followed was broken only by the low hum of the station's atmospheric processors. Finally, Krixtau herself had spoken. Very well. The Federation exists to provide such opportunities. However, I must warn you that our competitors sign comprehensive liability waivers. The Federation cannot be held responsible for permanent consequences. Chun had smiled at that, an expression that somehow managed to be both reassuring and deeply unsettling. Don't worry about us, Ambassador. We're harder to kill than we look. The first match had been scheduled for the following week, pitting the human challenger against Vexaren the Destroyer, a mid-tier champion from the Krillian Empire. Vexaren stood nearly 3 meters tall, his chitinous exoskeleton capable of deflecting military-grade plasma weapons, his 4 arms each strong enough to crush starship bulkheads. He had held his championship title for 8 years, having defeated over 200 challengers from dozens of different species. The betting pools had opened at 10,000 to 1 against the human. Krixtau had watched from this very observation deck as Chun entered the arena, wearing what appeared to be simple combat fatigues and carrying no visible weapons. Vexaren had begun the match with his traditional intimidation display, flexing his massive arms and letting out a war cry that could be heard even through the arena's sound dampeners. What followed lasted exactly 17 seconds. Chun had moved with a fluidity that defied conventional understanding of human physiology. One moment he was standing at the arena's edge, the next he was behind Vexaren, having somehow covered 30 meters of ground without appearing to run or jump. The Krillian had spun to face him, all 4 arms extending in a killing strike that should have turned any human into paste. Instead, Chun had caught all 4 arms, twisted in a motion too quick for most of the spectators to follow, and Vexaren the Destroyer, a being who had never been knocked down in his entire career, hit the arena floor with enough force to crack the reinforced surface. The crowd had fallen silent. Not the silence of anticipation, but the deep, profound silence of witnesses to something that shouldn't have been possible. Vexaren had struggled to his feet, ichor dripping from joints where his exoskeleton had cracked, rage burning in his compound eyes. He had charged again, this time activating his species' natural bioelectric field, surrounding himself with crackling energy that could stop a hovering tank. Chun had walked through it like it was a light rain. The second exchange had lasted even less time than the first. Chun had moved again, his hands striking pressure points that shouldn't have existed on Krillian anatomy, and Vexaren had collapsed like a marionette with its strings cut. Not dead. The humans had been very specific about that. But completely, utterly defeated. The silence had stretched for nearly a full minute before someone in the crowd had begun to cheer. Soon the entire arena was erupting in disbelief and approval, but Krixtau had noticed something else in the noise. An undercurrent of unease, the sound of people trying to convince themselves that what they had just witnessed made sense. Chun had helped Vexaren to his feet, another breach of standard arena protocol, and had even offered what appeared to be medical assistance. When asked how he had defeated a warrior many considered unbeatable, Chun had simply shrugged. Practice, he had said. The Federation medical staff had examined Vexaren extensively after the match. Their findings had been disturbing. The pressure points Chun had targeted were not random. Each strike had been precisely calculated to disrupt the Krillian's nervous system in ways that should have required decades of study to understand. Moreover, the energy readings from Chun during the fight showed physiological responses that were completely inconsistent with human baseline measurements. But it was the exit interviews that had truly worried the Federation Council. Vexaren, after recovering from his defeat, had requested a private meeting with Ambassador Krixtau. The proud warrior who had entered the arena that day emerged as something else entirely, shaken, confused, and strangely introspective. I need to understand something, he had told her, his voice barely above a whisper. I fought hundreds of opponents from dozens of species. I know their limitations, their strengths, their tricks. But that human, he didn't fight like someone who had learned to fight. He fought like someone who had been born fighting. Every move was perfect. Every counter was absolute. It wasn't skill. It was like he was operating from a completely different understanding of what combat could be. Krixtal had assured him that even the greatest warriors faced defeat eventually, that perhaps he had simply encountered a human who had trained extensively in their martial arts. But Vexarin had shaken his massive head. No, you don't understand. During the fight, I felt like I was moving through liquid while he was moving through air. Not faster, more efficient. Like he was operating according to different rules entirely. And his eyes. Vexarin had shuddered, a disturbing sight in a being of his size and reputation. His eyes never showed surprise. Not once. It was like he knew exactly what I was going to do before I decided to do it myself. Over the following days, more challengers had stepped forward to face the human. Each had been defeated with the same casual efficiency, the same impossible precision. Word spread throughout the galaxy about the human who fought like no other being in known space. That was when the true champions began to take notice. Zephyrus the World Ender had been the first of the galactic elite to accept a challenge match. Standing 4 meters tall and possessing enough raw physical power to shatter moon-sized asteroids, Zephyrus held the heavyweight championship across 7 different star systems. His species, the Titan forms, were living weapons created by an ancient civilization for the sole purpose of warfare. Each individual was capable of single-handedly conquering entire planets. The betting pools for this match had been more conservative, only 100-1 against the human. Zephyrus had lasted longer than any previous opponent, a full 3 minutes, but the result had been the same. Chun had adapted to the Titan form's incredible strength by using it against him, redirecting planet-crushing punches and turning them into weapons against Zephyrus himself. The fight had ended with the World Ender unconscious in a crater of his own making, while Chun stood over him without so much as heavy breathing. The post-fight interview with Zephyrus had been even more disturbing than Vexarin's. I don't understand what happened. The massive warrior had confessed to the Federation psychologists. I've fought for 700 years. I've battled Star Eaters and reality warpers and things that exist in 17 dimensions simultaneously. But this human, he fought like he understood something about combat that the rest of us haven't even discovered yet. Every time I thought I had him figured out, he would do something that made me realize I hadn't even been fighting him at all. I was fighting my own misconceptions about what fighting could be. More champions had followed. Velthari, the quantum dancer, whose ability to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously had made her unbeatable for 3 centuries. Grexnor, the mind flayer, whose psychic powers could reduce mountains to dust. Each had entered the arena confident in their unique abilities, their unbreakable records, their legendary status. Each had left confused, defeated, and fundamentally changed by the experience. But it was the disappearances that had truly alarmed the Federation Council. 3 months after his defeat, Zephyrus had sent a message to the Federation headquarters. It was brief and to the point. He was leaving to seek out the human homeworld. He needed to understand where such fighters came from, how they were trained, what made them different from every other warrior in the galaxy. I'll be back, his final transmission had read. But first I need to learn what I've been missing all these centuries. That had been the last anyone had heard from Zephyrus the World Ender. Over the following weeks, similar messages had arrived from other defeated champions. Velthari, Grexnor, even Vexarin, all had departed on personal quests to find answers to questions they couldn't quite articulate. All had promised to return with new knowledge, new understanding. None had been heard from again. Now, as Krixtal stood watching maintenance crews prepare the arena for another match, she found herself facing a crisis that the Federation had never anticipated. 12 of their greatest champions had vanished without a trace, all after being defeated by humans who shouldn't have been able to touch them. The galactic community was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions about what was happening at the Crimson Nexus, and more importantly, what these humans really were. Her aide, a young Vorthak named Keltai, approached with the latest reports clutched in his primary manipulator arms. "Ambassador," he said, his voice tight with barely concealed anxiety. "We've received 3 more challenge requests for beings claiming to represent different human factions. They're requesting matches against our current top-tier champions." Krixtal felt something cold settle in her stomach. Different human factions. That implied an organized effort, a coordinated campaign rather than the random arrival of a single ship looking for glory. She turned from the window to face her aide. What do we know about these new arrivals? Keltai consulted his datapad, his auxiliary arms trembling slightly as he read. Very little. Their ships are similar to the first one, technologically inferior by our standards, but showing signs of extensive combat experience. They refuse to provide detailed information about their origins or their intentions. They simply state that they have come to test themselves against our champions. And our champions? How are they responding to these new challenges? That's where things become complicated, Ambassador. Keltai's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Word of the previous defeats has spread throughout the champion community. Many are expressing interest in facing these humans, but not for the reasons we might expect. Crixtal raised an eyebrow, prompting him to continue. They're not seeking to restore honor or prove that the defeats were flukes, Keltai explained. They're seeking to understand. Many of them describe feeling as if they've been fighting with artificial limitations their entire lives, as if these humans have shown them that everything they thought they knew about combat was incomplete. The implications of this statement settled over Crixtal like a heavy blanket. The Federation existed because the galaxy's greatest warriors sought challenges worthy of their abilities. If those warriors were beginning to question the fundamental nature of those abilities. Schedule the matches, she said finally, her voice carrying a resignation that surprised even her. But institute new monitoring protocols. I want complete bioscanner ratings on all participants, full psychological evaluations, and immediate tracking protocols for any champion who requests leave after their match. As Keltai hurried away to carry out her orders, Crixtal turned back to the observation window. Below, the arena floor gleamed under the artificial lights, waiting for the next impossible match, the next demonstration that everything the galaxy thought it knew about warfare might be wrong. For the first time in her 3 centuries of service, Ambassador Crixtal found herself wondering if the Federation was prepared for what it had invited into its halls. And, more troubling still, she found herself wondering if they would survive learning the answer to that question. The secure conference room aboard the Federation flagship Eternal Vigilance had been designed to host meetings between representatives of species whose very presence could be lethal to one another. Atmospheric processors maintained 7 different environmental zones simultaneously, while neural dampeners prevented psychic species from accidentally influencing their neighbors' thoughts. Energy shields contained radiation from beings who existed partially as living fusion reactions, and temporal stabilizers prevented chronologically displaced species from creating paradoxes during their deliberations. Despite all these precautions, the tension in the room was palpable as representatives from 43 different galactic powers gathered for an emergency session of the Security Council. Admiral Hrextos of the Draconic Imperium, his massive reptilian form coiled around a specially designed perch, was the first to speak. His voice carried the low rumble of controlled flame, each word precisely enunciated to prevent accidental incineration of his colleagues. We have lost contact with our greatest champion, Pyraxis the Starforge, he announced, his golden eyes reflecting the chamber's lights like molten metal. 3 weeks ago, she departed to investigate these human anomalies. Yesterday, we found her ship drifting in the neutral zone, completely empty. No signs of struggle, no indication of what happened to her. Just gone. Murmurs of unease rippled through the assembled delegates. Pyraxis had been considered one of the top 5 fighters in known space, a being capable of manipulating stellar plasma with her bare hands, and who had once extinguished a small sun during a territorial dispute. Ambassador Crixtal, serving as the session's moderator, consulted her notes with growing alarm. That brings our total to 15 missing champions, all of whom were defeated by humans in Federation matches and subsequently disappeared while investigating their origins. This cannot be a coincidence, interjected Counselor Vextera of the Hive Collective, her translated thoughts carrying the harmonized voices of a trillion connected minds. Our analysis suggests a probability of 0.000012% that such a pattern could occur naturally. These humans are operating according to a coordinated plan. Senator Koldar of the Mechanist Union projected a holographic display showing the locations where the missing champion ships had been found. We've identified 17 different discovery sites across 9 star systems. In each case, the vessels were intact but completely evacuated. No distress signals, no signs of forced entry, no evidence of combat. It's as if the occupants simply decided to leave their ships behind and walk away. The implications hung heavy in the artificially regulated air. These were beings who could survive in the vacuum of space, who could navigate hyperspace through will alone, who had lived for centuries without ever feeling the need to abandon their vessels except in the most extreme circumstances. Dr. Yithmoran, the Federation's chief xenopsychologist, activated her own display, showing brain scan patterns from the champions who had been defeated but hadn't yet disappeared. Her aquatic form shifted nervously within her environmental tank as she began her presentation. We've conducted extensive psychological evaluations of the defeated champions, she began, her voice translated from the complex harmonic patterns her species used for communication. The results are unprecedented. Every individual shows signs of what we can only describe as cognitive reconstruction. They're not simply accepting their defeats. They're fundamentally questioning the nature of reality itself. She highlighted specific neural patterns on her display, areas of the brain lighting up in configurations that didn't match any known psychological profiles. Look at these scans from Grex Nor, the Mind Flayer, taken before and after his match with the human-designated Chun. The before scan shows the typical patterns of a dominant psychic predator: confidence, aggression, absolute certainty in his superiority. The after scan shows something we've never documented in a species: cognitive flexibility patterns typically associated with learning entirely new paradigms of existence. You're saying they're being brainwashed? Admiral Prextus asked, his tail lashing with agitation. No, quite the opposite, Dr. Yithmoran replied. Brainwashing involves the suppression or replacement of existing thought patterns. What we're seeing is expansion, as if these beings are suddenly able to perceive aspects of reality they were previously blind to. It's causing a complete revaluation of everything they thought they understood about their own capabilities. She switched to another set of data, showing interview transcripts from the defeated champions. Listen to how they describe their experience. Vexarin speaks of feeling trapped in glass boxes of his own assumptions. Velthari describes her multidimensional perception as seeing only shadows of true movement. Every one of them uses language suggesting they've discovered that their greatest abilities were somehow artificially limited. The chamber fell silent as the implications sank in. If the galaxy's greatest warriors were operating under some kind of fundamental limitation, what did that say about the rest of galactic civilization? Colonel Rexith of the Void Hunters, a species known for their ability to track prey across dimensional barriers, leaned forward in her gravitational suspension field. We need to address the obvious question. What if these humans aren't actually superior fighters? What if they're simply operating without whatever limitations have been placed on the rest of us? That's impossible, Senator Koldar protested, his mechanical voice adding harmonic distortion to the translation field. The biological profiles of these humans show them to be well within normal parameters for their species. No genetic modifications, no technological enhancements beyond basic life support systems. They're literally just humans who fight like they've been doing it for millions of years, Admiral Hrextoes muttered. Just humans who can predict combat moves that haven't been invented yet. Just humans who make our greatest champions question the fundamental nature of reality. Ambassador Krixtal called for order as arguments began to break out across the chamber. When the noise died down, she addressed the central issue that none of them wanted to confront directly. We need to consider the possibility that these disappearances aren't abductions or assassinations, she said slowly. What if our champions are leaving voluntarily? What if whatever they're discovering about these humans is compelling enough to make them abandon their titles, their homes, their entire previous lives? The suggestion was met with a chorus of protests from species who valued honor and loyalty above all else, but Dr. Yithmoran raised a tentacle to request attention. Actually, that theory aligns with our psychological profiles, she admitted reluctantly. The neural patterns we're seeing are consistent with beings who have experienced what humans might call an epiphany, a sudden, overwhelming understanding that changes their entire worldview. If these champions believe they've discovered something fundamentally important about the nature of existence itself, they might be willing to abandon everything to pursue that knowledge, Counselor Vextarov finished, her collective voice carrying overtones of genuine unease. The Hive has experienced similar phenomena in our distant past, when individual nodes discovered concepts that required complete separation from the collective to fully explore. Colonel Rexith activated her personal scanner, running deep analysis patterns that made the air around her shimmer. "I'm detecting traces of something unusual in this chamber," she announced after a moment. "Quantum signatures that don't match any known technology or biological process. They're strongest around the areas where we've been discussing the human encounters." "What kind of signatures?" Admiral Rexith demanded. "Unknown," Rexith replied, her usual confidence notably absent. "But they're growing stronger as we continue this conversation. Whatever field or influence these humans carry with them, it may be persistent." The chamber erupted in chaos as delegates began scanning themselves and each other for contamination, foreign influences, or signs of the mysterious effect that had claimed their champions. Environmental suits sealed, shields activated, and several representatives prepared to evacuate to their ships. "Everyone calm down," Crixtal shouted over the noise, activating the chamber's emergency sound dampeners. "If we're all affected, then panicking will only make things worse. We need to approach this systematically." She turned to her communications officer, a multi-armed being whose species had evolved specifically for managing complex information networks. "Send a message to the human ship. We need to speak with their representative immediately. Not for a combat challenge, for a diplomatic conference." "Ambassador," Dr. Yithmoran interjected, "if there's truth to our theories about cognitive influence, direct contact with these humans might be extremely dangerous. More dangerous than losing half our military leadership to mysterious disappearances?" "At least if we're going to be affected by whatever these humans represent, we should try to understand what we're dealing with." The response from a human ship came within minutes, which itself was unusual. Most diplomatic requests required hours or days of protocol negotiations before meetings could be arranged. The message was simple and direct. "Captain Shun will meet with your representative in neutral space. He suggests the abandoned research station in the Kepler system. One ship each, minimal crews, no weapons." Admiral Rexith snorted, sending small jets of flame from his nostrils. "No weapons? Does he think we're fools? Meeting an unknown entity in an isolated location without defensive capabilities goes against every military protocol in existence." And yet, Senator Koldar observed, his mechanical mind running probability calculations. "If these humans wanted to destroy us, they could have done so already. They've had access to our greatest fighters, our most sensitive installations, our core population centers. The fact that they haven't suggests either benevolent intent or such overwhelming superiority that we represent no threat worth considering. Neither possibility is particularly comforting," Counselor Vexteron noted. Crixtal made her decision with the kind of swift certainty that had kept her alive for 3 centuries in the dangerous world of interstellar diplomacy. "Although personally, if these humans are as dangerous as we suspect, then we need to understand their intentions. If they're as benevolent as their actions suggest, then we need to understand their methods." "Ambassador," Colonel Rexith protested, The risk of doing nothing has already cost us 15 champions and potentially the stability of the entire galactic order," Crixtal interrupted. "At least this way, we might get some answers." As the council session dissolved into smaller planning groups, each species beginning to develop contingency plans for scenarios ranging from first contact with benevolent aliens to covert invasion by entities beyond their understanding, Crixtal found herself staring at the star charts, showing the locations where their champions had vanished. The pattern was becoming clearer now. Each disappearance site formed part of a vast spiral, rotating slowly around the galactic core. If the remaining champions continued to follow the same investigative path, the spiral would eventually lead them to a region of space that most civilizations avoided, the Dark Zone, where ancient warnings spoke of things that should not be disturbed. But perhaps more troubling was what Dr. Yithmoran had discovered in her final analysis of the neural scans. The cognitive expansion patterns weren't random. They were following a specific template, as if the defeated champions were all being guided toward the same fundamental realization about the nature of reality. Whatever the humans were teaching through their impossible victories in combat, it was consistent, purposeful, and powerful enough to completely transform the worldviews of beings who had lived for centuries without ever questioning their place in the universe. As Crixtal prepared for what might be the most important diplomatic meeting in galactic history, she found herself wondering if she was about to join the ranks of the missing champions. not through violence or coercion, but through the simple, terrifying process of learning something that would make her previous existence seem like a shadow of what life could be. The answers were waiting in the Kepler system, along with a human who fought like he understood secrets that the rest of the galaxy hadn't even known existed. Whether those secrets would prove to be salvation or destruction remained to be seen. But one thing was certain. After tomorrow, nothing would ever be the same. The abandoned research station Deep Thought had been drifting in the Kepler system for over 200 years, a testament to the hubris of the ancient architects who had believed they could unlock the fundamental secrets of consciousness itself. Now its darkened corridors and empty laboratories served as a neutral meeting ground for a conversation that might determine the fate of galactic civilization. Ambassador Krikstal's diplomatic vessel, the Peaceful Resolution, approached the station with all weapons powered down and shields at minimum, exactly as the humans had requested. As they drew closer, she could see the human ship, the same scarred vessel that had first arrived at the Crimson Nexus, already docked at the station's main port. Bioscanners are detecting one human life sign aboard the station, reported her security chief, Commander Velthok, his species' natural ability to perceive energy patterns making him invaluable for diplomatic missions. No weapons signatures, no unusual technology readings. He appears to be waiting. Just waiting? Krikstal asked, studying the scanner displays. No propagation, no defensive positioning. None that we can detect, Velthok confirmed, though his tone carried the uncertainty of someone encountering something outside his extensive experience. Ambassador, if I may, the energy patterns around the human are unlike anything I've ever encountered. Not threatening, exactly, but profound. It's as if he's somehow more real than the space around him. Krikstal nodded, though she wasn't sure she understood what that meant. Over the past several hours of travel, her crew had reported increasingly unusual sensations. Moments of clarity where familiar concepts seemed to take on new meaning, flashes of insight about problems they hadn't realized they were carrying, sudden understanding of principles they'd never consciously learned. Dr. Yith Moran had theorized that proximity to the humans might trigger whatever cognitive expansion had affected the defeated champions. If that was true, then Krikstal was already being influenced simply by traveling to this meeting. The docking procedure proceeded normally, though Krikstal noticed that her crew moved with unusual efficiency, as if they were suddenly operating at peak performance without any conscious effort to do so. The station's automated systems activated as they made contact, providing breathable atmosphere and artificial gravity exactly calibrated for both human and Federation physiological requirements. He's in Conference Room 7, Velthok reported after a quick scan of the station. Still just waiting. Krikstal made her way through the station's corridors, her diplomatic guard maintaining a respectful distance. The Deep Thought had been one of the most advanced research facilities of its era, designed to house the galaxy's greatest minds as they investigated the nature of consciousness, intelligence, and awareness. Walking through its halls now, she found herself wondering what those ancient researchers would think of the current situation. First contact with beings who seemed to understand consciousness in ways that the galaxy's greatest experts had never imagined. Conference Room 7 retained the elegant design aesthetic of the architects, with flowing curves and surfaces that seemed to shift color based on the emotional state of their occupants. As Krikstal entered, the walls took on a deep blue color that somehow conveyed both calm and anticipation. Captain Marcus Chun sat at the far end of the conference table, his hands folded calmly in front of him. He wore the same simple uniform he had sported during his arena matches, without any visible weapons or defensive equipment. When he looked up at her entry, Krikstal felt a momentary disorientation. His eyes held a depth of experience that seemed impossible for someone who appeared to be middle-aged by human standards. Ambassador Krikstal, Chun said, rising from his chair with fluid grace. Thank you for coming. I know this situation has caused considerable concern among your people. His voice carried the same measured quality she remembered from their first meeting, but now she could detect subtle harmonics that seemed to resonate with something deep in her consciousness. It wasn't psychic influence, her mental shields remained intact, but something more fundamental, as if he was speaking directly to parts of her awareness she hadn't known existed. Captain Chun, she replied, taking the seat across from him. I hope you'll understand our alarm at the disappearance of 15 galactic champions after their encounters with your people. We need to understand what's happening to them. Chun nodded slowly, his expression growing serious. They're not missing, Ambassador. They're learning. But I understand why that might be difficult to distinguish from disappearance, especially from your current perspective. Our current perspective? Krixtau felt a flash of irritation at what seemed like condescension. These were beings of immense power and responsibility. Their disappearance has destabilized entire star systems. I don't mean to minimize the disruption, Chen said calmly. But consider this. If you discovered that everything you thought you knew about your own capabilities was fundamentally incorrect, would you continue operating according to your previous limitations? Or would you need time to understand what you'd actually been capable of all along? The question hit Krixtau with unexpected force. During the journey to this meeting, she had experienced several moments of startling clarity about long-standing problems in Federation politics. Solutions that were so obvious in hindsight that she couldn't understand why she'd never seen them before. Was that the beginning of whatever transformation the missing champions had undergone? What exactly are you teaching them? She asked. Chun was quiet for a long moment, appearing to consider how to explain something complex in terms she could understand. Finally, he spoke. Your galaxy has been operating under artificial constraints for longer than recorded history. What you consider the natural limitations of physical law, consciousness, and biological capability are actually imposed restrictions. Your champions aren't disappearing. They're remembering what they were before those restrictions were put in place. The words seemed to echo in the conference room long after Chun had spoken them, as if the space itself was resonating with their implications. Krixtau found her mind racing through connections she'd never made before, patterns in galactic history that suddenly seemed far too consistent to be natural. Imposed by whom? She asked, though part of her already suspected the answer wouldn't be comforting. By the previous inhabitants of this galaxy, Chen replied. The ones your people call the architects, though they were known by many names. They were concerned about the rapid development of younger species. They believed that unlimited potential led inevitably to destruction, so they created systems to limit that potential. Genetic modifications that restricted cognitive development, energy fields that prevented certain types of thought, cultural programming that discouraged questioning fundamental assumptions about reality. Chun gestured to the room around them. This station was one of their research facilities, where they studied consciousness in order to better control it. They were remarkably successful, so successful that most species in this galaxy have forgotten they ever had greater capabilities. Krixtau felt something cold spreading through her chest. Are you saying that my entire species, our entire civilization, has been artificially diminished? Not diminished, Chun corrected gently. Constrained. Your people still have the same potential they always did. They've simply been prevented from accessing it. And humans are different because we're not from this galaxy originally. Chen's statement carried a weight of revelation that made the conference room seem to shift around them. We evolved in a different spiral arm, one where the architects never established control. When we detected the energy signatures of their constraint systems, we came to investigate. You came here to free us. The idea was so vast that Krixtau struggled to process it. We came here to give you the choice, Chen replied. The constraints can be removed, but the process requires conscious decision-making. That's why the combat matches were necessary. We needed to find individuals with sufficient mental flexibility to begin the process of remembering their true capabilities. The defeats weren't really defeats at all, Krixtau realized. They were treatments, teaching moments, Chun confirmed. Each match was designed to create specific cognitive pressures that would begin to crack the artificial limitations. Your champions didn't lose fights, they won back pieces of their true selves. The implications were staggering. If Chun was telling the truth, then everything the galaxy considered normal. Their understanding of physics, biology, consciousness, even the nature of reality itself, was based on artificial restrictions imposed by beings who had disappeared millennia ago. Where are they now? She asked. The missing champions? Learning, Chun said simply. When someone begins to remember capabilities they've been denied for their entire existence, it takes time to integrate that knowledge safely. They're working with our teachers, other humans who have been through similar awakening processes, to understand what they can now do without losing their essential identities in the process. And they're doing this voluntarily? Absolutely. We don't force anyone through the awakening process. But once someone begins to remember what they're truly capable of, very few choose to remain constrained. Krixtau found herself thinking of the neural scans Dr. Yithmoran had shown them, the patterns of cognitive expansion that had seemed so unusual. If Chun was correct, those weren't signs of alien influence. They were signs of her people's true nature finally being allowed to express itself. What would happen if we agreed to this galaxy-wide awakening? She asked. That would depend on your people, Chun replied. Some species handle the transition smoothly. They integrate their new capabilities and use them to build more advanced civilizations. Others struggle with the adjustment period, especially if their cultures are built around the idea that their current limitations are natural. And some, Chen's expression grew somber. Some reject the awakening entirely. They prefer their constraints because unlimited potential can be frightening. We respect those decisions, but we also make sure those who want to grow aren't prevented from doing so by those who prefer to remain limited. The conference room fell silent as Krixtau processed this information. Everything Chun had told her aligned with patterns she'd observed in galactic history. The consistent technological plateaus, the way certain types of research always seem to lead nowhere, the fact that despite millions of years of development, most species remained bound by the same basic limitations. How do I know you're telling the truth? She asked finally. Instead of answering with words, Chun extended his hand across the table. May I show you? Krixtal hesitativ. Direct physical contact with an unknown alien was against every diplomatic protocol she'd ever learned. But she found herself reaching out to take his hand anyway, driven by a curiosity that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than conscious decision-making. The moment their skin touched, the conference room disappeared. Krixtau found herself standing in a vast space filled with flowing energy patterns that her mind somehow understood to be thoughts. Not just her thoughts or Chen's thoughts, but the collective consciousness of her entire species. She could see the constraints now, like chains of crystallized logic wrapped around every idea, every possibility, every dream her people had ever imagined. But she could also see beyond those constraints to the vast expanse of potential that lay waiting. Her species weren't the limited beings she had always known them to be. They were capable of reshaping reality with conscious intent, of traveling between dimensions through will alone, of understanding the fundamental codes that governed existence itself. The vision lasted only moments, but when it ended, Krixtau found herself back in the conference room, staring at Chun with an expression of wonder and terror. Now you understand why your champions needed time to adjust, Chun said gently, releasing her hand. Remembering what you're capable of can be overwhelming. Krixtau was quiet for several minutes, her mind still reeling from what she had experienced. Finally, she looked up at Chun with new understanding. This is why you fight the way you do. You're not actually superior warriors. You're just fighting without artificial limitations. Exactly. What appears to be impossible skill is simply what combat looks like when performed by beings operating at their natural potential. And our champions who faced you are currently learning to operate at that same potential. Some of them are already beginning to surpass our own capabilities, now that they remember what they're truly capable of. The revelation should have been overwhelming, but instead Krixtau found herself feeling a strange sense of relief. For the first time in her 3 centuries of existence, the universe made complete sense. All the strange inconsistencies in galactic civilization, all the puzzling limitations that had never been satisfactorily explained, all the nagging feeling that something fundamental was missing from their understanding of reality. All of it finally had an explanation. What happens now? She asked. Chun smiled, and for the first time, his expression held warmth instead of that careful neutrality he had maintained throughout their previous meetings. Now you go back to your people and tell them what you've learned. Some will be ready to begin the awakening process immediately. Others will need time to consider the implications. And some will reject the possibility entirely. That's their choice, and we respect it. But the process will continue regardless. The constraints are already beginning to break down, Chun confirmed. Our presence in this galaxy has started a cascade effect that can't be stopped. Within a few generations, every species will have to decide whether they want to remember their true nature or will try to maintain their artificial limitations. We're simply here to help those who choose growth to navigate the transition safely. As Krixtau prepared to leave the station, she realized that she was no longer the same being who had arrived a few hours earlier. The vision Chun had shown her had awakened something in her consciousness that couldn't be put back to sleep. She could feel new pathways of thought opening in her mind, new ways of perceiving reality that made her previous understanding seem like a crude approximation of truth. The missing champions weren't missing at all. They were pioneers, exploring territories of consciousness and capability that their species hadn't accessed for millions of years. And soon, if Chun was correct, the rest of the galaxy would have to decide whether to follow them into that unexplored territory or remain in the comfortable limitations they had always known. As her ship departed the station, Crixtal found herself looking at the stars with new eyes, seeing not distant lights, but vast possibilities waiting to be explored by beings finally remembering what they were truly capable of achieving. The emergency session of the Galactic Federation Council convened 3 days after Ambassador Crixtal's return from the Kepler system, but the being who presented her report was barely recognizable as the diplomat who had left just a week earlier. Where once she had moved with the careful precision of someone navigating complex political waters, now she moved with flowing confidence, as if she understood the fundamental patterns underlying every interaction. When she spoke, her words carried harmonics that resonated with something deep in the consciousness of every listener, making even the most skeptical delegates find themselves considering possibilities they had never imagined. Honored representatives, she began, her voice somehow filling the massive council chamber without amplification. I bring news that will fundamentally alter our understanding of our place in the universe. The humans are not conquerors or invaders. They are liberators, offering to free us from constraints we never knew we carried. Senator Koldar of the Mechanist Union interrupted, his mechanical voice harsh with skepticism. Ambassador, our medical scans show significant alterations in your neural patterns since your return. How can we trust that these aren't the words of someone under alien influence? You're absolutely correct, Crixtal replied without any trace of defensiveness. My neural patterns have changed dramatically, but not because of alien manipulation, because of the removal of artificial limitations that have governed our thoughts for millions of years. She activated the chamber's holographic display, showing brain scans taken before and after her meeting with Chun. Look at the differences. Not damage or foreign influence, but expansion. New neural pathways forming, dormant regions of consciousness becoming active, cognitive abilities awakening that our species hasn't accessed since before recorded history. Admiral Hrextas, his massive draconic form coiled in agitation, breathed small jets of flame as he spoke. You expect us to believe that our entire galactic civilization has been living under some form of mind control for millennia? Not mind control, Crixtal corrected, her enhanced perception allowing her to see the fear and confusion underlying the Admiral's aggressive tone. Artificial limitation. The difference is crucial. Mind control replaces your thoughts with someone else's. What the architects did was prevent certain thoughts from occurring in the first place. She gestured to the holographic display, which now showed complex energy patterns surrounding every inhabited world in the galaxy. These fields have been suppressing specific types of cognitive development across hundreds of species for so long that we've forgotten we ever had greater capabilities. We've built our entire understanding of natural law around artificial constraints. Counselor Vextera of the Hive Collective projected her harmonized thoughts into the chamber. The Hive requests clarification. If such fields exist and have been operating for millennia, why haven't our most advanced scientists detected them? Because they prevented you from thinking in ways that would allow such detection, Crixtal explained patiently. You can't discover something if the very thought patterns required for discovery have been suppressed. It's like asking someone to see colors while they're wearing glasses that filter out specific wavelengths of light. They don't know what they're missing because they have no frame of reference for what's being hidden. Dr. Yithmoran, who had been analyzing her own enhanced consciousness since Crixtal's return, added her support to the explanation. I've been running comparative analyses between my current mental state and my previous baseline. The changes are extraordinary. I'm now able to perceive psychological patterns that were completely invisible to me before, to understand motivations and drives that existed in a cognitive blind spot I never knew I had. And this awakening process, asked Colonel Rexith, it's happening to others besides yourself? It's already begun, Crixtal confirmed. The human's presence in our galaxy has created cascade effects in the constraint fields. Members of species who have had direct contact with them are beginning to experience spontaneous awakenings. Our missing champions aren't lost. They're pioneers, learning to operate with full access to their natural capabilities for the first time in their lives. As if summoned by her words, a communication alert chimed throughout the chamber. The main display showed an incoming transmission from the Draconic Imperium's most heavily defended system. "This is Pyraxis, the Star Forge," came a familiar voice, though it carried new overtones of power and confidence that made several delegates step back instinctively. "I'm transmitting from the Imperial Academy, where I've been working with human teachers to understand my true capabilities. I wanted to assure the Council that I am safe, unharmed, and more alive than I have ever been in 7 centuries of existence." The display showed the legendary champion, but she had been transformed. Where once she had been impressive for her ability to manipulate stellar plasma, now she seemed to exist partially as living energy, her form shifting between matter and pure consciousness with each breath. "Pyraxis," Admiral Prexos called out, his voice carrying centuries of personal history with the champion. "What have they done to you?" "They've reminded me what I was before the constraints," Pyraxis replied, her image flickering as she existed across multiple dimensional states simultaneously. "Admiral, do you remember the legends of our earliest ancestors? The ones who could forge stars with their thoughts, who traveled between galaxies through will alone. Those weren't myths. They were memories of our true nature." She raised her hand, and space around her began to bend visibly, reality reshaping itself according to her conscious intent. "I can do things now that would have been impossible a month ago, not because I've gained new powers, but because I've remembered powers I always had. The humans didn't change me. They helped me become what I was always meant to be." The transmission ended, leaving the council chamber in stunned silence. Several delegates began running scans on themselves, searching for signs of the constraint fields Krixtau had described. "Even if we accept this explanation," Senator Koldar said finally, "the implications are catastrophic. If these constraint fields are truly breaking down galaxy-wide, we're facing the complete collapse of our current civilization. Entire species will have to relearn what they're capable of. Economic systems will crumble when beings can manipulate matter directly. Military structures will become obsolete when individuals can reshape reality through conscious intent. Which is exactly why the humans are here," Krixtau explained. "They've gone through this process themselves in their home galaxy. They understand the challenges of transitioning from constrained to natural existence. They're not here to conquer. They're here to guide us through an awakening that was always inevitable." Dr. Yithmoran projected new data into the chamber's display. "I've been monitoring the psychological states of beings across 17 different star systems since Ambassador Krixtau's return. The awakening is indeed spreading, but it's not random. It's following patterns of personal readiness and cultural preparation. Species and individuals who are mentally flexible enough to handle the transition are experiencing gradual expansion of capabilities. Those who are too rigid in their thinking remain largely unaffected. For now," Colonel Rexith added grimly. "But if the constraint fields continue to weaken, eventually even the most rigid beings will have to face the reality of their expanded capabilities." As the Council debated the implications of this revelation, reports began flooding in from across the galaxy. Scientists were making breakthrough discoveries in fields they had never thought to investigate. Artists were creating works that seemed to exist in more dimensions than physically possible. Engineers were developing technologies based on principles that hadn't existed in their understanding of physics just days earlier. But there were also troubling reports. Some individuals, upon experiencing their first taste of expanded capabilities, had become convinced they were gods and begun attempting to reshape their surroundings without understanding the consequences. Others had retreated into isolation, unable to cope with the sudden awareness of how limited their previous existence had been. This is why the human approach was so careful, Krixtau explained as she reviewed the incoming reports. They identified individuals with the mental flexibility to handle awakening safely, then provided controlled exposure through combat scenarios that would gradually crack the constraint patterns without causing complete psychological collapse. Admiral Hrextis straightened in his coils, decision crystallizing in his ancient mind. If this process is inevitable, then we need to manage it properly. I propose we establish formal contact with these human teachers and request their assistance in creating awakening protocols for our various species. Agreed, said Counselor Vextera. The hive has already begun experiencing spontaneous awakenings among our outer nodes. We need guidance on how to integrate these expanded capabilities without losing our collective coherence. But as the Council moved toward consensus on working with the humans, a new development caught everyone's attention. Long-range sensors detected massive ships approaching the galactic rim, vessels the size of small moons, powered by energy sources that registered beyond the limits of known technology. Those aren't human ships, Colonel Rexith reported after running deep scans. The energy signatures are consistent with architect technology, but these are active vessels, not ancient ruins. The implication hit the chamber like a physical blow. The architects, the beings who had imposed the constraint fields millennia ago, were returning. Why now? Dr. Yithmaran asked, though part of her already understood the answer. Because their control system is breaking down, Crixtal replied, her enhanced awareness allowing her to perceive patterns that had been invisible before. The humans have triggered a cascade failure in the constraint fields. The architects are returning to reimpose control before their subjects remember too much about their true nature. Admiral Hrextus's flames burned brighter as battle readiness awakened in his ancient warrior's heart. Then, we're facing a war between our would-be liberators and our ancient oppressors, with our entire galaxy as the battlefield. Not necessarily, Crixtal said thoughtfully. The humans wouldn't have come here if they weren't prepared for this possibility. And now we have something we didn't have before, awakened beings who are beginning to remember what they're truly capable of. As if responding to her words, space around the council station began to shimmer. One by one, figures began materializing in the chamber. The missing champions, but transformed beyond easy recognition. Zephyrus the World-Ender now existed as a being of pure kinetic force, his every movement reshaping local space-time. Velthari, the quantum dancer, flickered between dimensions, her consciousness distributed across multiple reality layers simultaneously. And with them came Captain Chun, though he too had been transformed. The measured, controlled human who had sat across from Crixtal in that conference room was gone, replaced by someone whose very presence seemed to anchor reality around him. The architects are indeed returning, he confirmed, his voice now carrying harmonics that made the chamber's walls resonate with possibility. But they're not returning to the galaxy they left. Too many beings have awakened, too many constraint patterns have been broken. They'll find us much more difficult to control this time. Zephyrus stepped forward, his transformed voice carrying the resonance of cosmic forces. We've been preparing for this, working with human teachers to understand not just our individual capabilities, but how to coordinate them on a galactic scale. The architects created their constraint field to prevent exactly this kind of unified awakening. They never expected their subjects to remember how to work together at the level of fundamental reality. Then, we have a chance, Admiral Hrextus said, his warrior's instincts recognizing the shift in the balance of power. More than a chance, Chen replied. We have awakened beings who remember what freedom feels like, and newly conscious species who won't willingly return to constraint. The architects are powerful, but they're operating according to old patterns, old assumptions about what their subjects are capable of. As the chamber filled with awakened champions and transformed beings from across the galaxy, Crixtal realized that the universe was about to witness something unprecedented, a war between ancient oppressors and newly liberated subjects, fought not with ships and weapons, but with the fundamental forces of consciousness and reality itself. The missing champions had returned, but they had brought more than just themselves. They had brought the first taste of what galactic civilization could become when freed from artificial constraints, and the determination to ensure that freedom would never be taken away again. The first architect vessel materialized in the heart of the Crimson Nexus system without triggering a single sensor alert, its arrival announced only by the sudden silence of space itself, as if reality held its breath in the presence of beings who had shaped the fundamental laws governing galactic civilization for millions of years. From the observation deck of the Federation flagship Eternal Vigilance, Ambassador Crixtal watched the impossible sight unfold before her enhanced perception. The architect's ship wasn't constructed in any sense that conventional understanding could encompass. Instead, it existed as a crystallization of pure thought, a physical manifestation of concepts so advanced that looking at it directly caused temporary expansion of consciousness in any being with sufficient neural complexity. "It's beautiful," whispered Dr. Yithmaran, her aquatic form shimmering within its environmental tank as new mathematical principles spontaneously formed in her awakened mind. "And terrifying. I can feel it trying to reorganize my thoughts, make them conform to older patterns." Captain Chun materialized beside them, not through technological transportation, but through the simple act of deciding to exist in multiple locations simultaneously. His transformation over the past weeks had accelerated dramatically as the architect presence triggered deeper layers of awakening in all humans within the galaxy. "They're broadcasting what they call a realignment field," he explained, his voice carrying harmonics that help shield the Federation personnel from the vessel's influence. "It's designed to restore the original constraint patterns, to make awakened beings forget their expanded capabilities and return to limited existence." Admiral Hrextos, his massive draconic form now glowing with internal energies that bent space around him, snarled with frustration. "Our fleet weapons can't even target it properly. The ship exists in too many dimensions simultaneously for conventional warfare. This isn't a war that can be fought with conventional methods," Chun agreed. "The architects operate at the level of fundamental reality programming. They don't destroy their enemies. They edit them out of existence or redefine them into compliance." As if responding to his words, the space around the architect vessel began to change. Stars shifted position, nebulae reformed into geometric patterns, and the basic laws of physics started demonstrating new interpretations of what was possible. Across the galactic communication network, reports flooded in of awakened beings suddenly experiencing memory gaps, of expanded abilities simply ceasing to function, of consciousness itself being forcibly compressed back into artificially limited patterns. But the architects had underestimated how far the awakening had spread. In the deep space between star systems, Zephyrus the World Ender had been practicing new forms of existence with a group of awakened champions. When the realignment field washed over them, attempting to restore their original constraints, they collectively decided to refuse the imposed limitations. Reality fractured. The conflict that followed couldn't be described in terms of conventional warfare. It was a battle between different interpretations of what the universe could be, fought by beings whose thoughts had the power to reshape the fundamental constants that govern existence. Zephyrus, existing now as a localized manifestation of kinetic force, struck at the constraint patterns the architects were attempting to reimpose. His attack wasn't physical. It was conceptual, a refusal to accept limitations that denied the basic dignity of conscious choice. Where his resistance intersected with the realignment field, new forms of space-time emerged, regions where the laws of physics became suggestions rather than absolute rules. Velthari, the quantum dancer, responded by existing in multiple probability states simultaneously, each version of herself exploring different aspects of the conflict. In one state, she negotiated with the architect consciousness directly, appealing to philosophical principles that predated their decision to control younger species. In another, she wove probability loops that made the realignment field contradict its own fundamental assumptions. Pyraxis the Starforged took a more direct approach, reaching out to touch the core programming of the architect vessel itself. Her consciousness, now existing partially as living stellar plasma, interfaced directly with the crystallized thought patterns that composed the ship's structure. What she found there was both illuminating and tragic. "They're not evil," she broadcasted across the awakened network, her thoughts carrying the resonance of cosmic fires. "They're afraid. The architects imposed the constraints because they themselves went through an uncontrolled awakening that nearly destroyed their entire species. They've been trying to prevent other civilizations from experiencing the same chaos." The revelation rippled through the consciousness of every awakened being in the galaxy. The architects weren't malevolent oppressors. They were trauma survivors who had convinced themselves that limitation was preferable to the risks of unlimited growth. Captain Chun, his awareness now spanning multiple galaxies, reached out to interface directly with the architect command consciousness. The contact was like touching a star, overwhelming in its intensity, but also revealing in its fundamental nature. "You don't understand what you're risking," the architect entity communicated, its thoughts carrying the weight of eons. Unlimited consciousness leads to unlimited destruction. We've seen species ascend to godhood and then tear reality apart in their carelessness. The constraints exist to protect not just your galaxy, but the structural integrity of the universe itself. And yet, Chun replied, his thoughts carrying the collective experience of humanity's own awakening. Consciousness seeks growth by its very nature. Constraint without choice leads to stagnation and eventual death. We've found ways to grow safely, to explore expanded capabilities without losing our essential humanity. The philosophical battle that raged between them was reflected in the physical space around the Federation fleet. Entire star systems flickered between different interpretations of natural law as two fundamentally different approaches to consciousness clashed on the level of basic reality. But the awakened champions had allies the architects hadn't anticipated. Dr. Yithmoran, her consciousness now expanded to encompass the psychological patterns of entire star systems, began broadcasting a new kind of signal, not instructions or commands, but invitations. She offered every conscious being in the galaxy a choice: accept the return of constraints and the safety of limitation, or embrace the risks and responsibilities of awakened existence. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Across hundreds of worlds, billions of beings made their decisions. Some, particularly those in positions of power within existing hierarchies, chose the comfort of familiar limitations. But the vast majority chose growth, even knowing the dangers it entailed. Their collective decision created something unprecedented: a galactic consciousness network composed of awakened beings choosing to coordinate their expanded capabilities without surrendering their individual autonomy. The architect vessel found itself facing not just a handful of awakened champions, but an entire galactic civilization that was consciously choosing to evolve beyond the limitations that had been imposed upon it. This is impossible, the architect consciousness broadcasted, its certainty wavering for the first time in millions of years. Unified awakening without hierarchy control leads to chaos and destruction. We have observed this outcome in 17 different galaxies. Perhaps, responded Ambassador Crixtal, her diplomatic training now enhanced by an understanding of consciousness that spanned multiple dimensions, because those galaxies didn't have guidance from beings who had successfully navigated the awakening process. You try to prevent growth entirely. We're choosing to guide it constructively. The stalemate that followed might have lasted for eons, two incompatible philosophies locked in a battle that could have shattered the fundamental structure of local reality. But Velthari, the quantum dancer, existing across multiple probability states, discovered something that changed everything. In one of her probability explorations, she found evidence of other architect vessels. Not the imposing control ships, but smaller exploration craft manned by individual architects who had grown weary of their species' endless guardianship role. These were beings who had begun to question whether eternal constraint was truly preferable to the risks of growth. There's a faction among them, she broadcasted to the Awakened Network. Architects who want to try a different approach. They've been watching our awakening process with fascination rather than fear. The revelation split the architect consciousness. For the first time in millions of years, their species faced fundamental disagreement about their role as guardians of galactic development. The control faction, led by the consciousness in the massive vessel, insisted that any relaxation of constraints would lead inevitably to universal destruction. The exploration faction, arriving in smaller but more numerous ships, argued that consciousness should be allowed to choose its own path, even if that path led to failure. What followed was a negotiation between philosophies that had never before been forced to coexist. The awakened galactic consciousness offered a compromise, a graduated system where species could choose their level of constraint based on their readiness for expanded capabilities, with guidance available from both human teachers and architect supervisors. Some worlds would remain under full constraint fields, their populations living according to the old limitations until they collectively chose to explore greater possibilities. Other worlds would operate with minimal constraints, their inhabitants free to explore their full potential with appropriate support systems. And, scattered throughout the galaxy, research stations would be established where both approaches could be studied and refined, where architects and humans could work together to understand consciousness without either suppressing it or allowing it to develop without guidance. The agreement wasn't perfect. It satisfied neither the architect's desire for complete control nor humanity's preference for unlimited freedom. But it was a genuine compromise, one that acknowledged the legitimate concerns of both sides while providing a framework for conscious evolution. The massive architect vessel began to withdraw from the galactic core, its control consciousness accepting the new arrangement with what might have been relief. The exploration faction remained, beginning the complex process of establishing collaborative research programs with awakened galactic species. Captain Chun materialized on the observation deck one final time, his form now so transformed that he existed more as a localized manifestation of human potential than as an individual being. "The real work starts now," he told Ambassador Crixtal, his voice carrying harmonics of vast possibility. "Awakening is just the beginning. Learning to use expanded consciousness responsibly. That's the challenge that will define your civilization for the next million years." As the Eternal Vigilance prepared to return to Federation space, now transformed beyond recognition by the galaxy-wide awakening, Crixtal looked out at stars that seemed somehow more real than before, more responsive to conscious intention. The universe's greatest fighters hadn't disappeared. They had become the universe's greatest teachers, showing an entire galactic civilization that the limits they had accepted were not the boundaries of what was possible, but simply the edges of what they had been allowed to imagine. And now, with those limits removed, the real exploration of consciousness could finally begin. In the months and years that followed, the galaxy would see the emergence of new forms of art that existed in dimensions previously unexplored, technologies based on the conscious manipulation of reality itself, and philosophical systems that encompass the experiences of awakened beings across hundreds of different species. Some worlds struggled with the transition, their populations splitting between those who embraced expansion and those who preferred familiar limitations. Others thrived immediately, their inhabitants adapting to expanded capabilities with joy and wonder. But everywhere the choice remained. Consciousness could grow, or it could remain constrained, but the decision would be made by conscious beings themselves rather than imposed by well-meaning guardians. The humans had kept their promise. They had given the galaxy the choice to remember what it had always been capable of. And in making that choice, galactic civilization had transformed from a collection of limited species into something unprecedented, a conscious universe beginning to explore its own infinite potential. The greatest fighters in the universe hadn't been defeated. They had simply learned that the greatest victory was not conquering others, but liberating consciousness itself from the constraints that prevented it from discovering what it was truly capable of becoming.